This fall, we're hosting 3 months of peace focused on the topic, Building Peace Through Social Justice. The conference is co-sponsored by Johnson County Community College and the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University. My name is Louis Duguid, a longtime journalist, author, and lecturer here in Kansas City, and Political Action Committee Chair for the National Association for Multicultural Education. We are recording this session, so if you have any concerns about that, please take appropriate action, such as turning off your video. And keep an eye on the chat box. Our presenter today will leave some time at the end for Q&A. If you have a question, please type it in at any time into the chat box and we'll get to it in the end. The 2020 Greater Kansas City Peacebuilding Conference began with 2 sessions in September, which discussed the role that professional media outlets are playing in promoting or implementing social justice. Recordings of those sessions are posted to the conference website, and the address is in the chat box. We encourage you to access them if you didn't attend those sessions. Our speaker today is joining us from the United States Institute of Peace in Washington. Her name is Tamana Salih-Kudin. She's the Director of South Asia Programs, and she oversees the Institute's work in Pakistan and broader South Asia. She comes into this role with extensive regional expertise in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Sri Lanka. Her primary focus has been examining conflicts and conflict resolution across South and Central Asia and the Middle East, particularly those involving non-state actors and militant groups. She joined the Institute in 2018 as a senior expert on peace processes, where she led a program to build thought leadership and expertise on sustainable and inclusive peace processes. Salih-Kudin joined the Institute after 12 years in the US government, focused on South Asia and conflict resolution from 2014 to 2017. And she was a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the US Department of State. During this time, she led a team of experts pursuing a peace process between Afghanistan Taliban or the Afghan Taliban and government of Afghanistan. From 2011 to 2013, she served as director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the National Security Council, focusing on US-Pakistan relations and the Afghanistan peace process. Salih-Kudin has served as a political officer at the US Embassy in Islamabad and an analyst on South Asia. Prior to joining the US government, she worked as an attorney on international law issues in South Asia. I give you our speaker today, Ms. Salih-Kudin.
Thank you so much, Louis. It's very kind of you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to examine social justice and peace building in an international context. I applaud Kansas City and the sponsors, Johnson County Community College and others, for putting together such a relevant conference on the importance of peace building and social justice in our communities. And I understand that most of your conversations and presentations have focused domestically on what we can do, on the current milieu in the United States and what we can be doing in terms of social justice in our own country. But I think I'm here to talk more about an international perspective. So today I'd like to share with you some examples and lessons from South Asia. And in doing so, I hope to start conversations amongst yourselves and maybe be inspired from the work that's been done in the past and that's currently being done around the world. As Louis mentioned, my name is Thamana Salikaddin. I'm Director for South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace, or USIP, is this country's national, nonpartisan, independent institute. We were founded by Congress, and we're dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We were created in 1984, and our creation was a result of 2 decades of work by activists, both outside in communities and inside of Congress, to establish a national institution focused on peace. We're an institution that embodies America's commitment to peace and peace building by working internationally, meaning outside of the US, obviously, to resolve conflicts through nonviolent means. And so, I hope to present some of my work and some history with all of you. Before I joined USIP, as Louis mentioned, I spent 12 years in the US government, focused on national security and foreign policy. I worked at the White House as a national security director. I worked at the State Department leading negotiations with the Taliban and other groups. My work has focused on conflict resolution, often between states, but also looking at causes of conflict within states. So within countries, whether it's with the government and non-state actors, between citizens, and other sources of conflict. And while you may often hear about, we read about in the press, are military means to solve many of these conflicts, especially the ones you see in South Asia and other places, my job, both in government and at USIP, was to really understand the complexity and often entrenched nature of these conflicts, to explore the motivations and the goals of the actors and try to find negotiated solutions. So that process of peace building within the government and at USIP seeks to acknowledge conflicts but means to resolve them without resorting to violence. And I think those lessons can be applied in our own communities. Though I will share an international lens, I think it is relevant to, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is not that different from Kansas City, I feel. And, I went to high school across from a dairy farm. Peace building is just as important in Cincinnati, Ohio, as it is in Kansas City, as it is across the world. And so I just want to share some of these examples with you. Now, just to lay out what we mean by South Asia. So, South Asia proper, what I'm going to talk about largely is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But given that I've worked extensively in Afghanistan, which we usually characterize as Central Asia, I may share an example or two from Afghanistan as well. I mean, these borders have shifted over the eons and are all relative to what's going on. So why South Asia? What's going on in South Asia? So South Asia is home to over 1 billion people. It's linguistically, religiously, ethnically very diverse. There are people who live in dense urban population centers like Mumbai or Karachi, and also there are vast, fertile rural areas where farmers and others live to support the societies across South Asia. South Asia is home to ancient civilizations that come out of the Indus River Valley basin there and have been there for centuries and centuries. You could ask what characterizes South Asia, and it could be a myriad of things. You could talk about poverty, you could talk about high technology, you could talk about urbanization, demographic changes, economic precariousness or economic booms, environmental degradation, separatist and militant violence, and, as I will share with you today, a long history of people working and organizing for social justice. So this is a region that is very complex, has a lot to offer, and has had conflict in the past and continues to have conflict that I think we can learn about. Now, the topic I've been given is pretty broad, so I'm going to try to give you a little bit of the background on social justice and sort of activism, where it gets its roots in South Asia, but also talk about some of the newer current issues, roots of conflict, but also who and what, how are people organizing to solve conflict in South Asia. So as we explore social justice, I want to acknowledge that South Asia has a long history of movements led by the people for freedom and justice. And probably the most quintessential, and the one you may know in passing, it's really the defining conflict, was the struggle for colonial independence. The British and other European powers colonized all the countries of South Asia at various different times, but I think it was the British Raj, which is the most consequential here. So for the British, India, which is now, then colonial India, is now modern day Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, modern day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So colonial India was the crown in the British colonial enterprise, and it was a huge moneymaker for Britain. So if we talk about why colonialism, I mean, a lot of it comes down to mercantile business. So scholars who study tax and revenue data estimate that the British extracted $45 trillion from colonial India between 1765 and 1938. And in the late 1600s, India had one of the highest GDPs. This is India, meaning a broader India than what we think of as a modern nation state, one of the highest GDPs in the world. And the colonial experience shows that their GDP did not grow during that whole period of colonialization because most of the resources were removed from the country. And so the famed historian, British historian William Dalrymple, writes in his latest book about the East India Company, and I would really recommend this book for anyone who's actually interested in the Indian colonial experience. It's called The Anarchy, and it's a history of the East India Company. He says that one of the very first Indian words that came into the English language was the Hindustani, and Hindustani is a sort of predecessor of the languages of Urdu and Hindi that are spoken across the subcontinent. It was the slang for plunder or loot. So when you say loot, that is actually an Indian word. And it was unknown outside of India until the late 18th century when it suddenly became a very common term in Great Britain. And he goes on to explain that this was due to the large amount of riches that were extracted from the subcontinent and brought back to Britain. So in the Victorian period, as we enter into the 1800s, this sort of shady mercantile dealings of the East India Company were sort of looked down upon. And so colonialism was then dressed up in the more appropriate mission of civilization. So it was a benign national transfer from Britain to the poor souls of South Asia of knowledge, culture, railways, and the arts, which of course the savages of South Asia had nothing like that before. So this was how popular movies and books, even the ones we consume today, how they often romanticize the colonial period, right? You have British ladies all dressed up and being served by turbaned Indian men, and everything's good, and everyone just drinking a lot of tea and playing cricket. But in fact, for the citizens of South Asia, this colonial period was one of great degradation and of loss. It was also the period when the first censuses were done, dividing the communities of South Asia. So the first time in the late 1800s, the British did censuses along ethnic, religious, and caste lines. So once you start measuring people based on these different lines, you also apportion things based on those lines. So divided communities received apportionments of state resources, political representation, and taxation based on these divisions. So there was this idea of divide and conquer. Up until that point, you wouldn't see it, but if you look, Life magazine has some great pictures of that even at railway stations, the British instituted separate drinking fountains, Hindu drinking fountains, Muslim drinking fountains, caste drinking fountains and rest areas, things that didn't exist before. So what you come to as you have this extortion of wealth, division of communities, the first anti-colonial movement that we really see is in 1857. It's called often the Indian Rebellion, and it was a major but ultimately unsuccessful uprising against the British Crown. The British often call this the Sepoy or soldier mutiny of 1857, whereas in South Asia, it is called the First War of Independence. And the rebellion began in 1857 in the form of a mutiny of Indian soldiers who were working in the then British army. So if you were a civil servant or if you were a soldier, you had to work for the British. So there were the Indians are the ones who staffed all of these British enterprises. This rebellion erupted into civilian rebellions across all of India, mostly across the north, but also in other pockets across the south. And really, it's hard to underestimate the root causes of this mutiny. So the main reason you could say is this concept of British paramountcy, the belief that British dominance in Indian political, economic, and cultural life, which had been introduced to India in 1820, that everything about the British was better. And so, if there was soldiers, their general had to be a Brit. If there were civil servants, their boss had to be a British person. So everything was paramount when it came to the British. And so this increasingly use of tactics to usurp any semblance of control. So even Indian princes had less and less control over any of their own lands. So it ranged from the elite down to the common man. The common man experienced undermining of their religious, cultural, societal norms. And so the mutiny had far-reaching impacts in Indian society, and it launched many movements for independence. And so there's a myriad of things that start in 1857. But I want to really talk about the quintessential, the Indian self-rule movement, which was in the early 1900s. It was a mass movement based on, it encompassed various sections of society, so different stratas of society, different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different linguistic groups. And although the underlying ideology of the campaign was anti-colonial, it was supported by a vision of independent, capitalist economic development coupled with a secular, democratic, republican, and civil libertarian political structure. So the last stages of the self-rule struggle started in the 1920s and were really characterized by Indian National Congress's adoption of Mohandas Gandhi's policy of nonviolence and civil disobedience and several other campaigns. So it is this Gandhi's insertion of the ideas of nonviolence and civil disobedience that continue to reverberate across South Asia and have influenced social justice movements across the world, including famously Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights struggle in the United States. He quotes Gandhi in many of his own speeches. So the movement was made up of not just Gandhi. I mean, we've all heard of Gandhi, but there were many different individuals and efforts. And I think this is really important when we talk about social justice. So there were nationalists like Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Bhagat Jatin, Surya Sen, who preached armed revolution to achieve self-rule. So not everybody was preaching for just nonviolence against the Brits. There were poets and writers such as Rabindranath Tagore, Subramaniam Bharati, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, and Qazi Nazrul Islam, who used literature, poetry, speeches as a tool for political awareness. There were feminists like Sarojini Naidu, Prithalata Wadar, and Begum Rokeya, who promoted the emancipation of Indian women and their participation in national politics. And very famously, there was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who's the father of the Indian Constitution, who championed the cause of disadvantaged sections of Indian society in the significant self-rule movement. And there were parts of that movement that we often don't hear about. For example, in the Pashtun-dominated NWFP, which is now part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, there was Khan Ghaffar Khan, who was known as the Frontier Gandhi. And he used his belief in nonviolence and found that in Islam, he was a Muslim, he promoted this nonviolence from a religious perspective and organized 100,000 people to be an army of service and nonviolence. And so there were these individuals all over. It was a mass movement that brought together all of these different people. You know, the most famous is Gandhi. And what's notable, if you see pictures, for example, you may have seen the famous pictures of his salt march. Indians were banned from making their own salt because you had to buy salt from the British and you had to pay tax on that salt for the British. So Gandhi led a very one of the major acts of civil disobedience was marching to the sea and making their own salt. And they were all jailed for it. But in that march, what is very significant is that he made sure to make it an inclusive march. So you see women and men, you see elderly people and young people, you see Muslims and Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, you see people of all different castes and societal backgrounds marching. And that was on purpose. They wanted this to be something that reflected broader society, that you couldn't bring peaceful transformation of society unless you actually reflected all of society. Now, Gandhi had a philosophy of truth-focused, nonviolent, non-cooperation, which is in Hindi or Urdu known as satyagraha. And he brought this, he started off this in South Africa, actually. He was from an elite family living in South Africa. He was a lawyer, British trained lawyer, and he began to push for independence and organized a resistance to a 1919 law that gave British authorities carte blanche to imprison any suspected revolutionary. So after the 1857 War for Independence or mutiny, there were a whole host of laws implemented by the British to basically lock up anyone who was calling for independence. So when he started this resistance, the British responded brutally by mowing down 400 unarmed protesters in what was known as the Amritsar Massacre. And so after this massacre, it really, I think, jolted a lot of Indians to their senses. And he pushed even harder for home rule. They encouraged boycotts of British goods and mass protests, such as the salt. Another thing was cotton. So the British would take the raw materials and have them made into textiles in Great Britain and sold back to India. So it was banned. You could not buy local fabric. And so in a form of protest, you saw Gandhi and his followers wearing khadi or homespun cotton. And this, was very important so khadi became the sort of a sign of defiance against the British to wear homespun cloth rather than buy the British goods. By this point, when he was doing these salt marches, a 240-mile march to the sea, and doing these huge shows and rallies for the Quit India movement against the British, at this point, Britain imprisons almost 60,000 peaceful protesters. That includes, actually, my great-grandfather was in his home state of Orissa, was a member of Congress and took part in salt marches in the state of Orissa. So they were then imprisoned. They were often beat in what's called lathi charges, or charges where they would beat the protesters, oftentimes breaking bones, making them bloody, and then mass arrest these. So there were people all across the country in their own ways joining these types of protests against colonial rule. He also protested discrimination against the untouchables, or India's lowest caste. He negotiated, at this point, unsuccessfully with the British for home rule. But undeterred, the Quit India movement had started a campaign during World War II. And this is really where it picked up momentum during World War II. And he was imprisoned by the British during World War II, Gandhi, and was wasn't released for many, many years. So the turning point in the mass movement actually comes during World War II. You saw the peak of the campaigns of the Quit India movement by many, many different parts of the movement. What was really significant is you had 2.5 million Indians, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, who were all part of the British Army fighting alongside the British for the Allies against the Axis. And often you don't see this, there's a lot of critique. For example, the famous movie Dunkirk. They don't show a single Indian soldier, but there were thousands fighting there alongside the British in the North African front, in many fronts. So these 2.5 million soldiers come back home, and they have fought and died in the thousands for the British, and yet have no semblance of home rule and no respect in their own country. And this really ignites the movement. You have huge demonstrations, you have arrests of over 100,000 people by the British, and the balance really tips towards Indian independence. Gandhi is finally released in 1944 from jail, and the British finally realize that their time's up, and they make a plan, a very hastily, let me say, plan for withdrawal from the subcontinent. And it was a very bittersweet victory for Gandhi, because he opposed the partition of India. And so because Britain was in such a hurry to leave, they had basically a civil servant who had never visited India draw the borders of what these new countries would be. And so in 1947, you see independence of India and also the independence of then Pakistan. Unfortunately, conflict starts from the very beginning because of these ill-defined lines and really no preparation for independence and partition. You see huge sectarian riots and the death of millions of people who are crossing these newly made boundaries. Literally, the boundaries were not announced till days or hours before partition. So you had the hugest, you had over 1 million people trying to cross these borders to move to their new homelands. So, I mean, that's sort of our history lesson. I don't want to spend too much on that, but, protest activity in modern India and broader South Asia really dates back to these agitations against British colonial practices. And so South Asia, and India in particular, is famous for nonviolent resistance campaigns that took place during the freedom struggle. And the struggle has often, that unresolved issue of colonialism is also some of the underlying reasons for so much of the conflict that remains in South South Asia, and as is similar in much of post-colonial Middle East and Africa, where you have unresolved conflicts that are created by colonialism but manifest themselves now. And so I want to talk about some of the current sources of conflict. I mean, there are definitely some big interstate conflicts, the unfinished business of partition and contested homelands, issues such as Kashmir, which was a princely state where the people wanted to go with one country or to be independent. The ruler wanted to go with another country. Both India and Pakistan claim it, and continues to lead to conflict between states, between India and Pakistan, but also conflict internally for the citizens of Kashmir who feel oppressed and caught between these two huge states. There are divisions between, in terms of ethnicity and religion. So states of colonial India, the lines were drawn right through them. So if you took the state of Punjab or the state of Bengal, they just arbitrarily drew lines. And so there are wounds left between these states. And India-Pakistan is definitely the biggest rivalry, two nuclear armed nations, and they continue to have cross-border firing and a lot of instability between them. But there are other states. Bangladesh became independent in 1971. Again, ethnicity and language and rights of minorities played a huge role in that war, where East Pakistan separated from what was then West Pakistan and became the independent state of Bangladesh. You have conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Again, boundaries that are drawn by the British through Pashtun homeland. So there's ethnic groups that are on both sides of that line. And often Pashtuns and Kurds are pointed to as the two largest ethnic groups that don't have their own homelands and live in various different countries. And lastly, I would say a lot of the interstate competition, as we're looking at it now from a national security perspective, the increasing influence of China, India-China rivalry, a closer alliance between between Pakistan and China. So those are the interstate rivalries. I want to focus, given that we're talking about social justice movements, a little bit more on intrastate conflict. So the remnants of colonial rule, land apportionment based on sectarian and ethnic divisions, religious, linguistic, and ethnic minorities not feeling like they have a say in these new nations in the last 70 years, have really time and again reared their head. And recently, I would say in the last 10 years, the rise of right-wing nationalist, populist messaging, constructed ideas of monolithic identities, even though these are very diverse countries, and a growing pressure on minority rights, anti-secular movements. And lastly, I would say economic disparity and environmental degradation have really led to an increase in conflict. And you see increased denial of political rights and freedoms. COVID is a time when people are using the coronavirus in these areas to deny people even further political rights. The interesting thing about South Asia is all of these countries are ostensibly democratic countries. So these are not dictatorships that are implementing this. These are people voting, and largely these are fairly, robust democracies based on a British parliamentary model. So they're very boisterous democracies, but you have people voting in right-wing, anti-democratic, populist movements that are anti-minority, anti-secularism. And so we face the problem, how do you address this when this is done not in a dictatorship, but actually in a democracy? So we're seeing an increase across the board of arrests of political dissenters, protesters, lack of media freedom, a use of new technologies to spread a lot of falsehoods and fake news, especially used to stir up violence against minorities and others. So I just want to point to a few quick examples of this. In Pakistan, you're seeing increased sectarian violence, violence against religious minorities. You see ethnic Baloch and Pashtun minorities facing more state violence or aggression against them. We also see, women, youth, just access to justice issues. So you have the very famous Lawyers' March a few years ago in Pakistan. In India, we see this growing intolerance against Muslims and other religious minorities, Christians. You see it against lower caste Dalits. There is, the Kashmir issue. There's Northeast India, which has been often on the Nagaland and Assam issues, where local places want autonomy and their own rights, their own linguistic and governance freedoms. In Sri Lanka, we see with the recent elections, a push for a monolithic Buddhist Sinhalese state. And coming out of 30 years of incredibly horrendous civil war, you still now see Tamils and Muslims pushing for their rights and for reconciliation. That being said, South Asia really does have a strong history of organizing and protests, as I mentioned. You have a vibrant civil society trying to hold governments accountable, highly competitive elections, relatively independent judiciaries, sometimes that's fading in places, boisterous media, though now there's a lot more clamps down on media freedom. This democracy is under stress in these different countries. And so political power has increasingly become centralized. And so civil society is really trying to push back and hold government accountable. And especially in terms of access to justice. We talked a lot about the historical examples. I want to give you some very key recent examples of where mass movements and the activists for social justice are working. Pakistan, most recently, I would call out the Aurat March, or the Women's March against gender-based violence and women's rights. This was just last month. This started in 2018 with the Me Too movement across the world inspiring this, but women organizers in Pakistan from a grassroots level really organized with other groups and other social movements, against, for children's rights, for rights for minorities, and have come out in huge protests. This last one was really tied to a horrendous rape in which the police themselves engaged in victim blaming. And the current movement has really pushed not just for laws, which obviously they need, but the laws that are already on the books are not implemented. So they're really pushing parliament and leaders, police, et cetera, to use the laws that are already on the books, and also for societal change. And they faced a lot of pushback, a lot of deterrence from when they started in 2018, but just in 2 years, you can start seeing changes of opinion and a lot more support from every sector of society that societal norms for women, and especially related to gender-based violence, have to change. In India, you've seen in December 2019, if you all have been paying attention, right before the COVID pandemic, there was anti-CAA and NRC protests. So the CAA is a Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed by the Modi government in India to ostensibly allow religious minorities from other countries to gain asylum, just not Muslims. But, on its face, it appears that maybe it's not targeting Muslims. But civil society within India saw this as just another brick in what they're seeing as increased religious intolerance against Muslims and other religious minorities. So, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom listed India as a country of particular concern for the first time since 2004. And it really shows the increased religious hostility and sectarian conflict. But I would say the one shining part of the protests, which started in December and continued until the shutdown really for COVID in March, were that you saw a convergence of interests between not just minority Muslims, but other minority groups and sections of the majority Hindu community who saw this as threatening their belief and values such as secularism and the constitutional democracy that has really been the cornerstone of rule of law in India. And so they came out en masse, really led by students. People talk about the youth. This was students at the forefront of urban protests that spread all across India, alongside academics, authors, activists, and in large cities in the north and the south, and really arguing that this law violated the country's secular principles and was turning India into a majoritarian state. Unfortunately, the police and the government has really cracked down on protests and protesters, and they've used fairly flimsy laws and some even without trial to hold people for long periods. And the COVID pandemic allowed them really to just quash the protests. So, that's a mass movement that continues to have momentum in India. In Sri Lanka, I would say the Tamil and Muslim protests that just actually started this week against the current government's anti-democratic moves. So I don't know how many of you are paying attention to Sri Lanka, but this summer they had a huge landslide victory for the Rajapaksas and their Buddhist Sinhalese nationalist party, who want to make Sri Lanka a Unitarian Buddhist nationalist country, a Sinhalese nationalist country. And this is extremely painful after 30 years of civil war, where there really hasn't been reconciliation for the grievances and many of the human rights violations against Tamils and Muslims in the country. So you continue to see different communities coming together to protest what they see as anti-democratic actions and attempts to stifle dissent, including attempts to change the Constitution to give those in power more leeway to act against protesters and similar movements. Last, I'd like to leave you with a great example from Afghanistan. And these are people, we haven't really talked too much about Afghanistan, but as we're, in a peace process in Afghanistan, you see the value of grassroots movements. So in 2018, you had peace marchers who are young, who are youth, religious leaders, women, and others who marched from distant provinces like Helmand and marched to Kabul, demanding that their government seek a peace solution. They held sit-ins across the country in solidarity, and they were greeted by people in cities all over that country of different ethnicities, of different religious backgrounds, who hosted the marchers in support of peace. And by the time, the government had to listen. The government really had to then push for a peace process. And in the current peace process, from my own experience, I would argue that the women of Afghanistan are the most organized, the most educated on this, and are pushing the hardest for keeping their rights. They're the ones who stand up against the Taliban's interpretation of Islam. So you see women religious scholars willing to argue for women's rights and really talk about preserving the rights for women, youth, and minorities in Afghanistan. So this is really just a glimpse of things that are happening in South Asia. I do want to end a little with a story of what you can do, not just at these big, huge protest levels, but USIP works to support this type of work even at the grassroots level. So our Peace Innovation Fund, for example, in the Swat Valley of Pakistan, where you've seen lots of militant activity, you've seen suppression of schooling for children, for women especially, with just $7,000, USIP was able to help. There was a young man who was able to start up a program to revive poetry readings. So before the militants had taken over in his valley, young and old, women and men used to come together in the community and share poetry. And this was a way to build community and a way to actually do peace building. And so now that after military operations, the valley was cleared, a real way to do reconciliation in the community became this grassroots, this man who went around on his motorcycle, knocked on people's doors and gathered them to do peaceful poetry readings. And this is just one example of, we talk about these huge protests or nationwide movements, but I do want to end with, it's often these small things that lead up to the larger movements. It's small, localized peace builders, small, localized grassroots organizations that come together, that work in convergence to put pressure on government and to hold others accountable. Lastly, before I close, I just want to encourage you to continue to engage with USIP after this event. We have a lot of great peace building tools for you. We have a lot of events, and we have a dedicated peace education team that carries out this work. And for students and lifelong learners, we also have tuition free through the end of this year, access to our global campus courses online at usip.org. We have peace building courses, negotiation and alternative dispute, just a myriad of great classes for those who are interested in peace building. So thank you so much. And I look forward to the questions.
I want to thank you for taking the time and putting together this comprehensive talk for us. I think that you give us a lot to mull over, digest, and also see that some of the problems that exist in our country are certainly in South Asia as well. We can certainly invite everyone who has questions to go ahead and put those in the chat box for us. There are a few in there already. So why don't we just go ahead and get started. One is the Brits and colonialism seem to have created similar problems in the Middle East. Is there hope for a lasting peace despite the long reach of global imperialism?
I mean, I wouldn't work for Peace Institute if I wasn't hopeful, but I do think, you know, colonialism and post-colonial thought, you can see, has impacts all over the world. In Africa, many of the conflicts we study in the Middle East and in South Asia. I think what's interesting is not so much, you know, obviously it's looking at the roots of that conflict, but in most places it's been 70 years. It's also looking at who in the current status quo usurps that power. Often it's about power dynamics. So the colonializer, the colonial nation leaves, but it may prop up certain groups, certain minority groups, certain majority groups, might prop up certain corporations to act in the similar ways. And here what I mean is we have to dig deeper. For example, in southern Punjab, for example, in Pakistan, we've long looked at, there's a lot of sectarian violence between Shia and Sunni, and you know, you think, oh, they just hate each other because of their religion. And then you look deeper, during the colonial period, the Shia, who are the minority, were made the feudal lords, and the Sunnis were made the peasants. So the land was given to a certain group to control another group. And so a lot of those disputes go back to that land apportionment. And so unless and until you deal with some of the underlying causes, it'll be very hard to deal with you know, the conflict at the top. On the other side, I would say we really do need to start young. I mean, some of these identity politics, these border issues, the conflicts, the hate that we teach each other starts at a very young age. So both India and Pakistan, for example, have spent 70 years in their curriculums teaching their students that the other country is the enemy. It's not just, even though they share a lot, they share culture, they share food. I mean, when I'm in India, people think I'm Indian. When I'm in Pakistan, people think I'm Pakistani, right? When I'm in Karachi, people say your Urdu is great. When I'm in Delhi, they say your Hindi is great. So I'm actually speaking the same language. So it's often our own, the way we build our national identity and national stories is to make someone the other. And I think we have to, and that's important in our own context. We can't build our national identity around otherizing people. Otherwise, you will always have conflict, right? If the only way you can bring a group of people together is making them hate someone else, it's not a very positive model for peace building. And so I think we need to look at cultivating new ways of thinking of our national identities. And again, national identity is something that's constructed. Post-World War II, lots of countries hired anthropologists and sociologists to help them construct their national identities. And so I think if we look at it critically, peace builders we can reconstruct national identity. What does it mean to be American, right? I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. You know, people ask me, where are you really from? I'm like, from the South. And I grew up in this country, and I worked for the US, I was a US diplomat. And when I worked in South Asia and the embassies, people would always be like, but you're not really American, right? They would look for the white man to be the US diplomat. And I would be like, no, I'm the one delivering the démarche. And it's only in the United States that someone like me could really be a US diplomat. And I think if we build on those type of you know, nation building identities, then you can overcome conflict, I think.
Here's another question. The Asia Times says that peace with the Taliban could lead to increased conflict in Pakistan as dissidents return to Pakistan. Should Pakistan be worried?
I mean, that's a really interesting question as we're looking at, you know, for the last 20 years, even US-Pakistan relationship and the AFPAC relationship has really been dominated by this war. So if you can resolve the war, what does that mean? I think there's both positive and negative here. I think the positive is that a resolution of the Afghan war through a peace process is something that Pakistan has long pushed for as well. Pakistan is involved, is helping the United States in the peace process. And so that is actually something positive. I think, you know, the US-Pakistan relationship has had so much friction because of Taliban safe havens within Pakistan. So once the war hopefully is over and the peace implementation process takes time, a long time. and that can be positive. On the other hand, no peace process ends all violence. So, you do a peace process, a peace deal to try to solve the majority of violence. There will always be spoilers. There will always be fringe other groups that cause violence. I think violence inside Pakistan has significantly come down. I do see some groups returning, but I don't necessarily see a huge spike in domestic violence. I would actually be worried about continued violence in Afghanistan. If implementation by the Afghan government with support of neighboring countries like Pakistan and the international community is not done, then you see peace processes break down. And this is really important. If the vast majority of peace deals break down within 5 years. And that's largely because everyone thinks signing the paper is the important part. Actually implementing and making sure it's implemented in an inclusive and equitable way is the way to ensure peace. Otherwise, you have resurgence of civil war.
And I'm sure with checks and balances too, so that people can verify that what a country says it's doing is actually
Exactly.
being done. Which raises another question, and that's how the Trump administration is engaged in this peace process. We have in the US a populist leader. The things that you described in many ways describe the Trump administration. And then, of course, Trump has been pushing America first at the I guess, the detriment of everywhere else, particularly in Afghanistan, where he just wants to leave, which would create a vacuum. So how is the Trump administration either helping peace efforts or making them worse?
Again, these USIP is a bipartisan institute, so I just want to preface that anything I comment is really my personal opinion. I think it's really interesting to look at the evolution of peace in Afghanistan. We have been at war in Afghanistan for almost 20 years, right? And when I worked at the White House, at the beginning of the Obama administration, I was a civil servant. I worked for the Bush administration and the Trump administration as well. At the beginning, peace was a bad word. Nobody could talk about it because we believed that we were going to win militarily, right? And 20 years later, we're not winning militarily. There were prospects for peace very early on in 2002, 2003, 2004, but we thought we could crush the Taliban militarily. Unfortunately, when you have what is a domestic insurgency that is supported by, I would not say the majority, but definitely some parts of the country, and who see the US as a foreign occupying force, the evolution of this has become that there's a stalemate, there's a military stalemate. And so within the Obama administration, and then actually in the Trump administration, everybody realized that the only way out is through a peace process. Now, the question is your peace process one that is sustainable? Are you making sure, as you mentioned, Louis, that you have the guarantees that we don't, that you continue to protect the rule of law, you protect minorities and women and others. And so, I think on this fact, the Trump administration has done well. Maybe not, President Trump himself has not been so involved, but his representatives and Secretary of State have worked to try to have this intra-Afghan dialogue. The one difference between previous policies was, the US here did a separate deal directly with the Taliban without the Afghan government. And now we have the Afghan government and other parts of Afghan society in conversation with the Taliban. I think the clock is probably the worst thing you can do for a peace process. So if you are in a hurry to get out, you lose leverage. And that would be my biggest critique. I think the administration has been really put forth an immense amount of effort for a peace process and does believe in an inclusive peace. I think the biggest detriment is the clock, right? So we have a domestic political clock that demands that we get out fast. But to ensure that peace lasts, you need to do it slowly. And so those would be my comments.
Okay. Another question is, it sounds like the elections in South Asia involve people voting in far-right leadership. Why do you suppose people are turning to these so-called strongmen? And is it because the voting percentages are low, or are there issues with voter suppression? And of course, we have that coming up here on November 3rd.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should actually look to some of these. I've been an election monitor in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, and it's incredible. I mean, India has like 1 billion people voting, and they do it all electronically and on multiple days and with very little voter to no voter fraud. I mean, it's actually incredible how these massive democracies work. So, I mean, I have to give credit to their democracies. They are these are not dictatorships. These are really vibrant multi-party. So these are parliamentary systems. These are not two-party systems. You have lots of regional parties. So you have a lot of tussle and bustle to make, so, you know, you're not voting just on a personality. You are voting for a coalition. So your party forms a coalition to be in the ruling. That being said, those are positive things. I think globally there has been a trend towards right-wing populism. I mean, I'm not someone who studied this, but you see Duterte in the Philippines. You see this a lot in different places in the world, and South Asia is no different. Some of this comes from uncertainty. People, you know, fears, economic fears, or fears that minorities are gaining too many rights, or fears of terrorism. People want a strong man who promises security, who promises economic growth. And I think growing economic disparity, you know, the haves don't want the have-nots to come after them. And so you do see that in different parts in South Asia. I also think a big factor in this is somewhat the cult of personality. So even though these are parliamentary systems, in Pakistan, people love Imran Khan. He was a famous cricketer who had no political experience. In India, people loved Modi because he was an outsider. He had, you know, he was a chaiwala, he sold tea, and he came from a very poor background and was supposedly a smart businessman. So there are these ideas. The Rajapaksas were big military guys. They crushed the Tamils and won the civil war. So people went for these strongmen personalities. In terms of voter turnout, South Asians actually have very high voter turnout relative to the US, but voter suppression is definitely an issue. Voter suppression, political bosses, sort of like the mobs of, you know, vote rigging and things, they definitely exist across South Asia. I wouldn't say any of these elections are perfect. And I would say internal democracy in parties is a huge problem. So there's a huge decay. You know, in India, for example, the Congress Party, which has long been the left of center party, which prides itself on secularism and all of these different things, is super corrupt. Its party has fallen apart in terms of internal structure, and it largely becomes, you know, one family or one group's fiefdom. And so people don't want to vote for that. People are looking for something different, and they're turning to right-wing populism. But that's short answer, I guess, to a very complicated question.
Definitely appreciate it. Here's another question. How can Islam be misunderstood and the peace process at the same time be built?
I'm sorry, what's the last part of that question?
How can Islam be misunderstood and the peace process be built at the same time?
So here, I think they mean the Afghan peace process. I mean, I would make one note. Maybe the person who's asking the question wants to clarify.
You have to unmute.
You have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, my question was that, you know, you put it in context of the colonial period and how it gave rise to this. Yet in all of this, the misunderstood part is that Islam is an integral part of the culture and the societies. And so on the one hand, right now, the Uyghur Muslims are being maligned, but yet you're going to try to do the peace process within the Islamic context. I mean, you cannot separate the Islam. I'm from Pakistan originally, by the way.
Yeah.
So that is one thing. And the other thing that I think, you know, people do not understand the difference between the urban and the rural divide. That thanks to the colonial byproduct, we still have a lot of ethnic identities that are not clear. So now you take Islam, you take the post-colonial byproduct, and then this creates a whole powder keg
Sure.
of disruptions.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that I'd like to offer in terms of peace building process was Imran Khan's attempt at building this huge Sikh
Yeah.
Gurdwara,
Which was amazing.
which was amazing. And it, even though the borders were closed, on the Pakistani side, Indians were allowed in mass numbers to come for their pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could talk to
Sure.
these dichotomies.
Sure. I mean, I just very briefly, since we don't have a lot of time, I do want to mention, so again, religion is not a monolith, right? I mean, South Asia is a great example where you can take any religion and use it, instrumentalize it for your ends, right? So you can take Hinduism and use it to justify violence against Muslims. You can take Islam and use it to justify violence against Christians. You can take Buddhism. You know, in the US, we think Buddhism's always peaceful. Sri Lanka was the first time I met very violent Buddhist monks who wanted to do nothing but kill Hindus and Muslims, right? So you can instrumentalize any religion, right? I want to say that up front. And people are not monolithic, right? People's interpretation of their own identity is not monolithic. So you could be Pakistani and Muslim and Sunni and a woman and a gender activist, and you could be many different things. And I think sometimes what happens is when we essentialize identities, we create these blocks that increase conflict. I think the Kartarpur example is a great example of where people are pushing for people-to-people contact, right? Where India and Pakistan refuse to talk to each other. They really don't have right now a track one diplomacy channel. At the same time, this building of the Kartarpur corridor, which allows Sikh pilgrims from India to come freely and worship at a very holy site inside Pakistan, because again, these are countries that are torn asunder without any sense, right? So your religious sites are in another country, your home village may be in a different country. These are the people-to-people peace building that we need to try to break the ice here. You know, governments can only do so much, and I think governments obviously are motivated by power. They're not motivated necessarily by religion or morality or any of these things. So to make your government be responsive to society, to be responsive to the demands of the people, it takes this sort of organizing. I would just mention, like, for example, the Afghanistan example. You have a wholly Muslim country, yet you have lots of different interpretations. I mean, just like Christianity is not a monolith and Hinduism is not a monolith, Islam is not a monolith, right? And Afghanistan has many different practices of Islam, not just minorities and sects, I'm saying within the majority Sunni understanding. And so it is about arguing what is most important in that country and letting Afghans themselves define what is the future, how religion plays a part, how culture plays a part. You know, for the Taliban, I mean, I met with the Taliban. Many of them are far more Pashtun cultural than they are religion. So they accept religious norms when they match with their cultural norms. But I think to an outside understanding in the West, it all just seems like all those Muslims out there, right? And I think one of the first things in peace building is to break that down. It's just try to understand one another. And I think that's important if you're in Kansas City or in Cincinnati, Ohio. You need to understand, even when we talk about Republicans and Democrats, whoever it is, everybody has multi-dimensional identities that motivate them for different things. And so if we can find convergence, I mean, that's what I do as a negotiator in peace negotiations. I look for the commonality. You know, sure, we disagree about a million things, but is there a point of convergence that we can use to move this conversation forward? And I think that's what peace builders across South Asia do. And intra-faith conversations are very active and are a huge part of South Asian peace building. I mean, as much hate as there is in South Asia, there are that many people working across South Asia to speak across religious lines.
Good point, and great place to put a period on this. And I want to thank everyone for attending this session of the Peace Building Conference. I want to encourage you to come back for next month's sessions on November 4 and 5 via Zoom. All of our speakers will focus on peace building through social justice in Kansas City, including issues of homelessness, poverty, racism, adequate health care, and gun violence. Some of the speakers include Reverend Dr. Vernon Howard Jr., and a presentation from Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas. For more information and registration, please visit the conference website or contact JCC International Education, and we hope to see you again in November. Thanks, everyone, and thanks also to our speakers.